What has to happen for a king to abandon God and seek the dead? How much desperation is needed to break the barrier between this world and the next? For Saul, the first king of Israel, the price was exactly this: his crown, his sanity, and his soul. And the night he paid that price, something impossible happened in an Endor cave. Something that no theology can fully explain. Something that still today forces us to ask, what truly returned from death that night? The story begins with a man who had everything and lost it by centimeters. Saul was chosen by God to be the first king of Israel. He was tall, handsome, charismatic. The people adored him. The prophets anointed him. He had armies, riches, divine favor, but he had something more: an invisible crack in his soul, a fissure that widened until it swallowed him whole. Saul's problem was not that he was bad. The problem was that he was weak. Weak in the most dangerous way, weak at the decisive moments. There was a day when God commanded him to wait for Samuel before offering a sacrifice. Saul waited. He waited until his soldiers began to desert him. He waited until the enemy was at his gates. And then, just before Samuel arrived, Saul broke down. He offered the sacrifice himself. And when Samuel appeared minutes later, the verdict had already been pronounced. God has rejected you. Your kingdom will not continue. Later on, God gave him another chance. He commanded him to completely destroy the Amalekites. Leave nothing alive. Neither man nor woman nor child nor livestock. It was a brutal order, impossible to justify with our modern morality. But in that context, in that ancient war, it was the test of obedience. And Saul failed again. He forgave King Agag. He kept the best livestock. He thought he could negotiate with God. He thought his judgment was better than the divine command. And Samuel appeared again. And this time the words were like knives. Obeying is better than sacrifices. Rebellion is like the sin of divination. Because you have rejected the word of God, he has rejected you as king. That was Saul's spiritual death sentence. And the worst part is that he remained king. He continued to wear the crown, but he was empty inside. The Spirit of God abandoned him, and in his place, something dark arrived. The biblical text calls it an evil spirit from God, a torment that consumed him from within. Saul began to have episodes, rage attacks, paranoia. He tried to kill David, the young man who played the harp to soothe his torments, because he knew David would be his replacement. Years passed. David fled, Samuel died, and Saul became a shadow of himself, a king without God, a man hunting shadows. And then the moment arrived. The Philistines, Israel's eternal enemies, gathered for war. They brought a massive army. They camped in Shunem. Saul gathered his troops in Gilboa. And when he saw the magnitude of the enemy's army, the text says something devastating. His heart trembled greatly. Saul needed to know what to do. He needed divine guidance. So he did what any king of Israel would do. He consulted God. But God did not answer, neither through dreams, nor through the Urim, nor through prophets. The silence was absolute, and that silence was more terrifying than any negative response, because it meant abandonment. It meant that Saul was completely alone, and it was in that emptiness, in that despair that shatters any principle, that Saul made the darkest decision of his life. He decided to consult the dead. This was an abomination in Israel. The law of Moses was clear. Anyone who consulted mediums, diviners, or necromancers should be executed. Saul himself had cleansed the land of these practices. He had expelled witches and sorcerers. He had done this to obey God. But now, without God, without options, without hope, Saul decided to seek exactly what he had forbidden. He said to his servants, "Find me a woman who has the spirit of divination." And they said to him, "There is one in Endor." Endor was a small village, hidden in the hills. It was not a place of power. It was a place of shadows. And there, in a cave, lived a woman whose name we will never know. The text simply calls her the medium of Endor, a woman who had survived Saul's purge, a woman who still practiced the forbidden art of speaking with the dead. Saul disguised himself. He took off his royal robes. He put on ordinary clothes. He took 2 trusted men and walked at night through the valley, with the Philistine army camped a few miles away. It was a tactical madness, the king of Israel abandoning his army on the eve of battle to visit a witch. But Saul no longer thought like a king. He thought like a man drowning. They arrived at the woman's house in complete darkness. They knocked on the door. She opened, suspicious, and saw 3 strangers. Saul spoke to her urgently. "I beg you to read my fortune through the spirit of divination, and to make me bring up the one I tell you." The woman stepped back. It was a trap. It had to be. "You know what Saul has done," she said. "He has eliminated from the earth the evokers and the diviners. Why do you set a trap for my life to make me die?" And then Saul did something extraordinary. He swore by God, "As the Lord lives, no harm will come to you because of this." He swore by the God who had abandoned him. He swore by the name that no longer responded to him. And the woman, perhaps out of her own desperation, perhaps because she saw something in his eyes, accepted. "Whom shall I bring to you?" she asked, and Saul replied, "Bring me Samuel." Samuel, the dead prophet, the man who had anointed him king, the man who had condemned him, the only one who could tell him what to do. Saul wanted answers from the only man who had always told him the truth. The woman began her ritual. We don't know exactly what she did. The text does not detail her spells, her invocations. But she did something, and then the impossible happened. She saw something, and she screamed. The scream was not theatrical. It was visceral. It was the scream of someone who has just seen something that should not exist. And what she saw made her realize who her client really was. She shouted to Saul, "Why have you deceived me? You are Saul." But Saul no longer paid attention to her. He was fixated on what had appeared. "Don't be afraid," he said. "What did you see?" And she, trembling, described the impossible. "I see gods ascending from the earth." An old man comes, covered in a cloak. Saul knew. He knew it was Samuel. He bowed his face to the ground. And then, from the other side of death, a voice spoke. "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me here?" The question was an accusation. Samuel was not pleased. He had not come voluntarily. He had been torn from his rest, and the first thing he did was rebuke Saul. But Saul, devastated, replied with raw honesty, "I am very distressed. The Philistines are fighting against me, and God has turned away from me, and he no longer responds to me, neither through prophets nor dreams. That is why I have called you, to tell me what I should do." It was the confession of a man completely broken. "God has abandoned me. I have no answers. I have no hope. You are my last resort." And Samuel, even from death, showed no mercy. "Why do you ask me, since the Lord has turned away from you and is your enemy? The Lord has done as he spoke through me. He has taken the kingdom from your hand and given it to your companion, David. Because you did not obey the voice of the Lord, nor fulfill the heat of his anger against Amalek, that is why the Lord has done this to you today. And the Lord will also deliver Israel into the hands of the Philistines with you. Tomorrow, you and your children will be with me." It was a death sentence, not a prediction, a sentence. "Tomorrow you will be dead. Your children will be dead. Israel will be defeated, and there's nothing you can do." Saul fell to the ground. The text says he fell as long as he was tall. His strength left him. He had not eaten all day. He had walked kilometers in the darkness. And now this, the final confirmation that everything was lost. The medium came to him. She saw the king of Israel, the most powerful man in the nation, lying on the ground of his cave like a corpse. And she felt compassion. She offered him food. Saul refused. "I don't want to eat." But she insisted. Her servants insisted. And finally, Saul got up, sat down, ate. The woman sacrificed a calf, made bread, served them, and Saul had his last supper in the house of a witch. Afterward, he got up and left, walked back through the night, returned to his army, and the next day, as Samuel had said, the Philistines attacked. The battle was a massacre. The men of Israel fled. Saul's sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, Malchishua, died in combat. Saul was seriously wounded by the archers, and knowing he would be captured, he took his own sword and let himself fall on it. The first king of Israel died by suicide on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines found his body the next day. They cut off his head. They stripped his armor. They nailed his body to the walls of Beth-shan. And so ended Saul's reign. Not with honor, not with redemption, with humiliation. But Endor's story does not end with Saul's death. It ends with a question that has tormented theologians for 3,000 years. What was that thing that appeared in that cave? There are three possibilities. The first, it was truly Samuel. The dead prophet was briefly resurrected by the power of God to deliver a final message to Saul. This interpretation is based on the fact that the text never suggests it was an illusion. The medium was surprised. She did not expect something real to appear. And Samuel spoke with the same authority he always had. He knew the future. He knew what God had decreed. If it was a demon in disguise, why would God allow the prophecy to be true? The second possibility, it was a demon, an evil spirit that pretended to be Samuel. This interpretation holds that God would never violate his own law by allowing necromancy to work. The dead do not return. Mediums only contact demons, and this demon simply repeated what Samuel had already said in life. It revealed nothing new. It only confirmed the judgment that had already been pronounced. The third possibility is the most unsettling. It was an illusion created by Saul's desperate mind. The medium saw nothing real. Saul saw nothing real. Everything was a psychological projection. Saul already knew he was going to die. He already knew he had lost God's favor. The only thing he needed was someone to confirm it. And his mind, broken by torment, created that confirmation. But none of these explanations are completely satisfactory, because the text is too specific. It describes the details with too much clarity. The medium saw something that terrified her. Saul heard something that destroyed him. And the next day, everything Samuel said was fulfilled with exact precision. What makes this event unique in the entire Bible is that it is the only recorded case where necromancy apparently works. All other mentions of mediums and diviners describe them as frauds, as deceivers. But here, something happened. Something that even the medium did not expect. And that leads us to the deepest question. Why did God allow this? If necromancy is an abomination, if consulting the dead is a sin worthy of death, why allow Saul to receive an answer? The most logical answer is that it was not a response of mercy. It was a response of judgment. Saul wanted to hear from God, and God, in his silence, gave him exactly that, a final word. A word of condemnation, a final confirmation that there was no escape, no redemption, no hope. Saul went to Endor seeking salvation, and he found his epitaph. But there is more to this story, something that is rarely mentioned. The medium of Endor showed more compassion towards Saul than God. She was a practitioner of dark arts, a woman condemned by law, someone who should have been executed. And yet, when she saw the fallen king, she gave him food. She offered comfort. She risked feeding the man who had tried to destroy all those in his craft. There is a brutal irony in this. The prophet of God delivered condemnation. The witch delivered bread. The representative of the sacred showed no mercy. The representative of the profane had mercy. And that forces us to ask ourselves, what does goodness really mean? What does justice mean? Because if God is just, then Saul deserved his fate. He had disobeyed repeatedly. He had had opportunities. He had chosen his path. But if we observe history as human beings, we see a man who was chosen for a role he could not fulfill. A man tormented by spirits that God himself sent. A man who died alone, desperate, rejected by heaven and devoured by the earth. The story of Endor is, at its core, a story about abandonment. About what happens when all doors close. When there are no prophets to answer, no dreams to guide, no signs to light the way. And in that emptiness, even the most powerful king becomes a beggar, knocking on the door of the forbidden. Saul was not an evil man. He was a weak man, and his life story is a warning about what happens when weakness encounters impossible responsibilities. When an ordinary man is placed in a position that requires a hero. When someone is anointed for greatness, they cannot sustain. David, his successor, committed sins worse than Saul's. Adultery, murder, betrayal. But David was forgiven. David was called a man after God's own heart. Why? Because David, despite his crimes, never doubted God. He never sought shortcuts. He never tried to negotiate. When confronted, he broke down. He repented. He returned. Saul never returned. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know how. And that is the deepest tragedy. A man who wanted to obey but couldn't. A man who loved God but couldn't reach him. A man who died seeking a word of hope and only found confirmation of his condemnation. And in that Endor cave, on that dark night, the last thread connecting him to the divine was broken. Samuel had been his bridge. And when Samuel returned from the dead, he did not come to rescue him. He came to bury him. But perhaps the most terrifying thing of all is not what happened to Saul. It is what it reveals to us about the universe. Because if this story is true, then death is not an impenetrable wall. There are ways to touch it. There are ways to call through the veil. And sometimes something responds. The question is, what is it that responds? Is it really the dead, or is it something older? Something waiting in the shadows? Something that uses our loved voices to draw us deeper into darkness? The dead do not speak, but something speaks in their name. And that something knows our fears, knows our longings, knows exactly what to say to destroy us. Saul learned this too late, and he paid the highest price. Not only his life, but his eternity. Because the text says something chilling. Tomorrow, you and your children will be with me. Samuel did not say, you will be in heaven. He did not say, you will rest. He said, you will be with me, in Sheol, in the realm of the dead. In the place where the shadows of ancient kings wait hopelessly. And that was Saul's last vision, not the promise of redemption, but the certainty of forgetfulness. But before closing this story, before leaving Saul in his tomb in Bethshean, we must ask a final question. A question that turns the mirror back on us. What would you do if all the doors closed? If every prayer met silence? If every sign you seek never appeared? If the sky became deaf to your voice and the ground beneath your feet began to crumble? Which door would you knock on? Which cave would you go to? What line would you cross if desperation were deep enough? Because we all have our Endor. We all have that forbidden place to which we will swear never to go. Until we have no choice. Until the pain is greater than our principles. Until the need for answers surpasses the fear of what we might find. And when you're there, in your own dark cave, knocking on your own forbidden door, wondering if anything will answer, remember Saul. Remember that he received his answer. And that answer destroyed him. Because sometimes silence is mercy. And sometimes the answer you're seeking is exactly the one you cannot bear to hear. Are you sure you really want to know?